Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch, Ratcliffe, your host. You know, as we come to the end of 2020, the year that can't end soon enough, we're looking forward to what's going to happen in 2021. And we were fortunate enough to get Katrine Brahic, who is the environment editor at The Economist, to join us to talk about an editorial she wrote in the November 16th, 2020 edition of The Economist. It was called "The World Could Turn a Corner on Climate Change." And that's a pretty optimistic position since a lot of people are feeling pretty fatalistic these days. Katrine, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and it was great to read the editorial. First, I want to start off with some of the basics that you wrote about, which is the UN held its 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, which they call COP26. What happened at that event?
So COP26, or more usually called COP26, in fact, was due to happen this year. But as a result of COVID-19 and everything else that has come with it, what is normally an annual meeting has in fact been deferred till end of next year. So there's been quite a lot of action. Surprisingly enough, there has actually been quite a lot of action on climate change in the absence of that COP, but we're waiting for the big meeting, or I should say we are preparing for what will now be the big meeting in the last couple months of 2021.
And what do they expect to do at that meeting that changes policy globally?
So COP26 was initially meant to be the COP that came 5 years after the Paris Agreement, which was made in 2015. So 2015 to 2020. Now, of course, now it's going to be on the 6th anniversary. But the importance of that 5-year cycle is that when the Paris Agreement was made, you had, nearly 200 governments coming around and hashing out this deal. And the big headline figure there was that for the first time, every government agreed that the global goal should be to limit global warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So that's no more than 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above what temperatures were in pre-industrial times, so sort of 18th, 19th century, basically. And that's quite an ambitious goal, particularly the lower end of that, the 1.5 end, because the important thing to know is we're currently at about 1.1 degrees. So we're approaching that very quickly. And getting everybody around the table, or in the room rather, to agree to that was a big achievement. But to do that, it's going to take a huge effort to cut global emissions. And that's something that each country needs to do within its own borders, and everybody needs to do it together. And that's where things get really tricky. The predecessor of the Paris Agreement, which was the Kyoto Protocol, did this in a sort of top-down way. It was limited to the rich countries, so developed nations, which at that point were the biggest polluters. And all of those countries basically split the effort that was required. I should note it, at the time that 1.5 to 2 degrees hadn't been agreed, but they split an effort to cut emissions between the nations. And it was sort of under the Kyoto Protocol, everybody was assigned a certain amount of emissions reductions that they needed to achieve by a certain date. That failed. And governments really didn't like being told what they should do. So the Paris Agreement took a different tack. Instead of telling countries how much they needed to cut emissions, it asked nations to offer up their best offers, basically. And that's known as the bottom-up approach to emissions reductions. And so all of these governments said, well, I can do X and I can do Y. And then at the end of the day, they totted it all up, or rather the researchers totted it all up and ran it through their climate models. And looked at what that could reasonably amount to in terms of temperature expectations for the end of the century, and it came to about 3.5. So nowhere near. Yeah, no, exactly, nowhere near the 1.5 to 2 degrees that was that was enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And so they had to kind of square that circle. And what they came up with, which is also enshrined in the Paris Agreement, is what's known as the ratchet mechanism. Mm-hmm. And that demands that every 5 years, again, that critical 5-year cycle, the governments come back together and basically up the ante. They increase the ambition of their cuts. And that, it could seem like a bit of a cop-out. You could argue that. But there's also a reasonable argument that at no point can anybody predict what sort of advances will come about in the future. So for instance,
they need to adjust.
Yeah, so they need to adjust. So nobody predicted the massive burst in renewables, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of allows greater ambition to happen as these technological and political and economic changes happen over the years. So this year, the COP26 that was meant to happen in 2020 was meant to be the first sort of tooth in that ratchet. The Paris Agreement still requires that these new promises be made by the 31st of December 2020. And we can talk about that. We just had a slightly different summit that gave a platform for that. Mm-hmm. But that was the significance of COP26. And we've achieved some of it, I think, with this sort of extension to the homework, as it were, that's been allowed by COVID-19. We're going to see more of that next year. And there are other things that will need to happen at COP26 in 2021. But that's sort of the big headline, really.
So these nationally determined contributions, the bottom up, we're going to make this effort, commitment by each country, have not really been aggressive enough, as we've been talking about. How many nations are on board with new, increasingly aggressive, nationally determined contributions, or NDCs?
So that number keeps changing. You've caught me off guard because I don't have it right in front of me.
Well, as of your writing, you said 4.
No, it's been a lot more. So this is where we come to what happened last week. God, I'm losing track of time these days, but it was last weekend. Yes.
It's easy to lose track of time in 2020.
I know. So in the absence of COP26, the UK government and the UN and actually France, Italy and Chile also hosted a virtual, what was called the Climate Ambition Summit. And at that event and also in the run up to that event, there was a big push for governments to come forth with new NDCs. So for instance, I think at the time that I wrote my piece, Britain had not yet made its new promise for cutting emissions by 68% relative to 1990 levels within the next 10 years. So that, for instance, is a significant advancement. There's been quite a few more NDCs that have been added, but really, this is a bit harsh, but of course, the focus of the attention is on the big emitters, and that is the European Union, China, America, which we can go into the details of America's position on this, the US, and then Britain, which we are now no longer counting as part of the European Union for what I would say are rather unfortunate circumstances. So those countries have made quite a lot of progress. So
first, let me ask this question. What do you think the world looks like if we don't take these actions?
Not good. So first of all, define these actions.
Well, if we do not keep emissions to a level that raise the temperature more than 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Right. So more than 1.5 degrees Celsius is particularly bad for small island states. That's actually a large part of the reason that the 1.5 is enshrined in the Paris Agreement. The sea level rises involved would be devastating. I mean, and it's not just, sea level rises in and of themselves, which can be measured in centimeters. It's the storm surges, as you as I'm sure you know, that go with that. So for every incremental increase in sea level rise, these storms that batter the coastlines can sort of sweep inland that much more. And of course, on small island states, which tend to be very flat, they can go very, very far inland.
But the same in Bangladesh too. I mean,
and the same, exactly. So the same is true in any low-lying, and you mentioned Bangladesh. We could also mention large swathes of the United States, of course, which are already suffering.
The state of Florida.
Yes, definitely. So the 1.5, how to put this? The thing is, it's a sliding scale, right? There is, I think most people, most scientists certainly would agree, no safe level of climate change. It's really a matter of what you deem to be acceptable. We are already seeing huge changes to global, regional, local climate. And I think that's something that has massively changed since even just in the last 5 years, since the Paris Agreement was made. And I think that's a good part of the reason for which we are now seeing increased interest and increased political willingness to tackle this issue, and also an increased level of activity from corporations and companies. We could talk about the fires, we can talk about what's happening in the Arctic, we can talk about rainfall, heat waves. All of these things are tightly linked to climate change, and the devastation, the impact on people, on economies is increasingly present, I think, in people's minds.
So one of the things a lot of folks are concerned about is the equity of the changes that we're going to make. And China, which has, of course, catapulted into the top tier of world economies over the past half century, is talking about reaching net zero by 2060. Americans, in particular, are concerned about the competition between our two countries, and they would like to know whether or not we can believe China's really on board with this. What do you think?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And actually, I think we can, but I don't think it's resolved. So, because a lot of action still needs to happen in China. That net zero target for China is going to be very difficult. And I think we'll find out actually in the next 12 months a lot more about how it plans to reach it. So a lot of countries have made net zero targets in the last 12 months. I think currently we're looking at about 127 nations that have either adopted or are considering a net zero by mid-century target. And for your listeners' sake, the net zero thing is not just some random buzzword that governments have latched onto. It's actually what the science tells us is necessary for the 1.5 degree target. So it's interesting, I think, on the one part that on the one hand, that governments are taking, some guidance from climate science. That in and of itself is huge. The fact that China has taken it is also really significant. And to your question, China doesn't normally say things when it comes to climate change. It doesn't normally publicly, globally, internationally announce climate targets unless it is very, very certain that it can achieve them. And in many cases, we've seen China adopt targets where it's basically already achieved them. In fact, generally, when climate analysts look at the Chinese promises, they tend to sort of see what China says it's going to do and anticipate, and to some extent sort of calculate that it can achieve more and probably will achieve more. So that's one reason for which I would take the Chinese promise of carbon neutrality by 2060 very seriously. I think the other thing is that the Chinese central government has clearly taken on this, the climate issue as central to the country's well-being. I think they're very aware of the fact that a huge challenge to their nation over the coming decades is going to be tackling climate change. And if they don't, then their country will suffer from the impacts. And then there's other signs, I think there's There's been some modeling internally in China by Chinese scientists and Chinese climate research groups that are that we know the central government pays very close attention to. And these groups have shown how China can actually achieve the net zero by 2060 target. So it is hypothetically feasible. The policies are not yet in place. And so that's why I say there's a lot that remains to be done. And also key to all of this is what's going to happen in the next 10 years. You can't just say in 30 years' time, we're going to zero out if you don't start working on that very soon.
Well, there is another country, of course, that until until just a few days ago, and if you count when we actually confirmed our president, wasn't paying attention to science very much, and that's the United States. How does America's return to the Paris Accord, which President-elect Biden has promised to do early in his administration, change your assessment of the potential for climate progress this year?
Yeah, I think it's a really significant move, actually. But I'd say that it's significant in combination with everything else that we're seeing on the global stage. And that includes China. It includes the clear ambition in the European Union to put climate change at the forefront of their policies for the next few years. They have a Green Deal. They're working very hard to follow their 2050 target up with some real sort of tangible policies that will get them there. Britain is also playing an increasingly important, they were lagging, I'd say, at the beginning of this year, but I think increasingly are taking this
It's been surprising what Boris Johnson has committed to.
It is. I'm still waiting for the money and the policies to follow. So this is the difference, for instance, between some governments and, say, the Chinese government. I feel like Western governments find it much easier to promise things that are several administrations down the line and that they don't need to worry too much about than the Chinese, which have a very different political system. And the Chinese, again, remember, they've got 5-year plans, rolling 5-year plans. So it's a very, very different setup. But back to the United States, the real achievement or the real change geopolitically in climate change matters over the last 12 months, I'd say, is that we now have the European Union, we have China, we have Britain out of ex-European Union, and now from January 20th, America, all pulling in the same direction on climate change, all having either already committed or about to commit to carbon neutrality by sometime around mid-century. And all of them also sending signals that they are, that the sort of at the core of their government, they're taking this issue very seriously. So, Joe Biden has appointed John Kerry. John Kerry is going to be central within the White House, looking at all of these issues across departments. It's not just something that's being relegated to a corner office, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of critical mass, I think, it's America coming on board, coming back into the Paris Agreement, but it's not just America on its own. It's the critical mass of major emitters and major economies all working together.
It's interesting to me that we've talked about China, the EU, and the United States, which are really the three major driving economies in the world right now. And each of them, in their own way, is setting themselves out as the leader in a green move. Should we be more focused as citizens on the opportunities in the green economy, or should we be more focused on the potentially increasingly draconian actions we would have to take to stop climate change if we continue to put it off? What would you suggest people emphasize?
How are those two things different?
They're the two faces of the issue. On the one hand, we could talk about how much worse this can get, including having to literally stop certain activities. Yeah. Or we could talk about the fact that if we go green, we can thrive with prosperity.
So it is both, right? I mean, this is the challenge of climate change, is that unlike, I think, any other issue apart possibly from a global pandemic, and the parallels have been made, it's an issue that affects all aspects of the economy, of society, of politics. Mm-hmm. And so, by necessity, it is going to come with both costs and opportunities. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right that for a long time, a very long time, people have focused on the challenges. And it's, I think to some people, climate change poses a threat to their way of life. And I think that's stopped progress in this domain. I think that's starting to change. In part, there's many reasons for that, but let's just name a few. One, I think, is increasingly businesses have become aware of the fact that climate change poses a risk to their bottom line, and so are more willing to look at how to minimize that risk, transform their businesses, and make them resilient going forward. So that, turns into, okay, where do we find the opportunities? You minimize risk, you find the opportunities. You do
forward rather than back.
Yeah. And I think this is really important. And I suspect that your listeners will be part of this. There is a huge popular movement of voters who increasingly think this is a central issue to their lives and who want to live in a different kind of society, a different kind of environment, a different kind of world. And a lot of that comes from young people who are either about to vote or are just starting to vote, who are either about to become employees and, the drivers of the economy, or who are already there. And so they matter. They matter a huge amount, and they matter much more, in a sense, and they will increasingly matter more to the future of our society, because they are it, right? So I think those two things pulling together mean that we're starting to see this seesaw of, risks and opportunities, possibly balanced towards the opportunities. But I do think the two things go together. What's changing is that we never used to talk about the opportunities. It always used to be about the cost of climate change. Yeah. And I think that's changing.
Yeah, and that brings me to my last question, which is what do you suggest, and I would ask you to point to decisions you're making, people do to try to influence the economy in the green direction?
Right. It's a really interesting question, and I think I get that a lot. I think there is a sense of hopelessness very often because, each individual is just one tiny fraction of the problem, and you can feel powerless, right? It's really disempowering. But actually, I think there are a lot of things you can do. So one thing is to find out what your own carbon footprint is, and there are plenty of places you can do that online. It can be a painful exercise. And once you've done that, you will have a sense of what the greatest contributor to your carbon footprint is and tackle that. If you want to be science-based, then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that as I mentioned, by 2050, we need global emissions to have reached net zero. So either eliminated everything you can eliminate, offset what you can't. But then more importantly, by 2030, emissions need to have halved. So strictly speaking, you want to be, doing something science-based within your own life, then look at your carbon footprint and aim to have it, cut it in half in the next 10 years. And that idea is not one I came up with. That actually came to me in a podcast that I hosted with Christiana Figueres, who negotiated the Paris Agreement. And she said, this is what I'm doing in my life. And it makes a lot of sense. I think also it gives you some kind of a feeling of power again. The other really important thing, and I think the American election has shown this more possibly than any other, is the power of the vote. If you feel powerless, elect leaders who represent your views and make sure that your views go to the power. In America right now, that means Georgia.
That's interesting. Of course, both sides of the divide feel that here so deeply that their interests are at risk. And what you're suggesting, and thank you, because you just justified Earth911. That is our goal, is to help people cut their carbon footprint.
The other thing is, I referred to this popular movement. I referred to young people. I really think, and to some extent know from having conversations with decision makers, that the demonstrations, the movements, the youth movements are being heard. And I think, very often we feel like it's just screaming into the void, but trust me, those movements are being heard. And as they get louder and louder, they become unavoidable for politicians. So that's another thing. You can vote, and that's a way of speaking to power. And you can get out on the streets and speak to power through the media and the rest of it.
But would you say that every time you spend $1, you're also voting?
Yeah, I'd say that's true too. Yes, I think that's a very good point.
It all adds up. Individually, we contribute to the economy. We contribute to the political debate.
Yeah,
in a variety of ways, and recognizing that we are more than the isolated, the monad in the system that can't change the system, and rather that the system is dynamic, like the environment. The better off we're going to be.
Absolutely, and there's increasing action from shareholders to express their voices again. It's spending $1. It's using your financial might as well. There's one of my favorite examples of this comes from a group called Client Earth, which is a sort of environmental legal NGO.
Lawyers on behalf of the planet.
Yes, so you're familiar with them. And you may know this, but there was what was billed to be the last coal-fired power station in Poland. And they bought, I think, I was told once it was one share. I think it might have been a few shares in the energy company that was proposing to build this power station. It cost them a few dozen euros.
Yep.
But by becoming shareholders, they were able to launch a series of shareholder actions, which accumulated with a court case that they won. And as a result of those, I think it was on the order of 30 odd euros that they bought, plus all of the legal costs behind it, but they're lawyers, so they can do that. They had the entire power station scrapped. That's
a lovely story. And it's also a nice capstone to this conversation. I'd love to have you come back and talk more about how companies are changing, because that is, I believe, the underlying story of 2020. Despite the politics, the economy moved ahead towards green.
Yeah, the movements in the economy are also fascinating.
Well, Katrine Brahic, thank you very much for joining us today.
Not at all. Thank you.
Folks, that's Katrine Brahic. She's the environment editor at The Economist, the excellent magazine. I encourage everybody to read it to keep up on what's going on. This is Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear, and I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, please take a moment to share this podcast with your friends. Sustainability is a team sport. And take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's take care of the planet. We'll see you soon.